Welcome to this presentation of Santa Barbara's earthquakes, droughts, floods, and shipwrecks through vintage postcards and photographs. In parts 4 and 5, we will examine two disasters occurring on the same day in our county. My name is George Sampanis, and I will be your host as we open a window into Santa Barbara's past. September 8th, 1923. The Cuba, originally launched in 1897 as the German SS Koblenz, she was seized by the United States during World War I and renamed the SS Sachem. In 1920, she was purchased by the Pacific Mail Steamship Company and renamed the SS Cuba. The Cuba was used to carry passengers and cargo between San Francisco, Havana, and other South American ports. On her last voyage, the Cuba was en route to San Francisco from Panama after a brief stop in Mazatlan. Working up the coast, she encountered thick fog for 3 days. She had been without the benefit of radio, which was inoperative, lacking spare parts. On the evening of the 7th, Captain Charles J. Holland retired for the night, leaving orders to be awakened if visibility became less than 5 miles, and in no case later than 3 a.m. in order to take soundings, leaving Second Officer John Rochot in command. First Officer Wise arrived in the wheelhouse to take the watch at 4 a.m., where he discovered the visibility had been reduced to less than 4 miles, and there was no sign of the captain. He immediately went to get the captain, who entered the wheelhouse in a hurry, partially dressed. Captain Holland directed an immediate turn to port, westward, and at that very moment, 4:30 a.m., Saturday, September 8th, the Cuba struck a reef off the western coast of San Miguel Island in the Santa Barbara Channel. What is absolutely amazing is how she was able to penetrate through reefs and shoals before grounding. See the box in the far left area. Captain Holland ordered reverse engines, and the Cuba briefly refloated, but was swung around by the heavy seas and ran into a submerged reef, stern first, demolishing the twin propellers. Her lower decks flooded, and she began to list heavily, causing a problem in launching the lifeboats. Despite the heavy seas and fog, all passengers and crew were safely loaded onto the lifeboats through the extraordinary efforts of Captain Holland and First Officer Wise. Captain Holland was the last to leave the ship. If getting the lifeboats and passengers wasn't enough of an ordeal, the captain then piloted a lifeboat through the reefs, shoals, high seas, fog, and belligerent seals and sea lions. After 2 tries, he was able to finally find a narrow foam-swept opening to the beach. After landing some 25 survivors, including 14 women on the beach, and believing it to be too risky and dangerous, he ordered the 3 other lifeboats to head out toward the mainland and seek rescue assistance. Lifeboat 1, commanded by Chief Engineer Owens, carrying 22 survivors. Lifeboat 2, commanded by Second Officer Rochot, carrying 24 passengers, and the third by Chief Officer Wise with about 15. The USS Reno, a 4-stack destroyer, was on a full-power maintenance run, having left Fleet activities in San Francisco. As the captain neared the channel, the fog thickened, causing him to make a momentous decision to go around the islands rather than enter the channel, the shorter but more dangerous route. A very wise and fortuitous decision that would lead to saving many lives. At about 3 p.m., we thought it was a fishing boat at first, but as we dashed by, I saw that it carried too many passengers for that type of craft. Farther out, we passed a second boat, and we knew then that they were in distress. Our speed was so terrific that we were forced to make a long circle of more than 5 miles to slow down before we reached the lifeboats, quoting Captain Barry, commander of the Reno, in the LA Times October 10th edition. Ironically, Lifeboat 1 and Lifeboat 2, with Owens and Rochot in command, were on a course heading west out to sea rather than towards the mainland, due to an erroneous compass setting. They were to thank their lucky stars they were spotted by Captain Barry's destroyer. Lifeboat 3, Chief Officer Wise related, "Soon we encountered 2 spouting whales. At first, neither was close enough to cause any great fear. Then, the one nearest us dived. When he came up spouting and thrashing the water, he was much nearer. He dived again and came up within 39 feet of our frail craft, spouting and beating the waves as if angered by our presence. We were unable to even attempt rowing away, for all our energies were needed to keep the light craft afloat, to keep her headed right toward the enormous waves, each one of which threatened to engulf us. Then the current helped us, for we were borne into the main channel away from the whales. The lifeboat, with 15 aboard, headed east along the south side of San Miguel Island, then through the San Miguel Passage as they entered the Santa Barbara Channel. They spent the night in the open boat, and Sunday morning, after being passed by several ships in the fog, they were spotted, rescued, and carried to San Francisco by the Standard Oil tanker W.S. Miller. In the meantime, the USS Reno, through rough and choppy seas and upset and angry pinnipeds, was able to rescue the remaining 25 passengers who had been on the rocky beach. Through this terrible ordeal, miraculously, all passengers and crew of the Cuba survived, and there were no serious injuries. Captain Holland and 8 other crewmen stayed with the wreck for 6 days and removed most of the ship's cargo, valued in the millions, including mail, silver bullion, and mahogany, to the camp that they had set up on the beach. A salvage vessel arrived. The cargo, Captain Holland, and crew headed for the mainland. What happened over the next few hours is a classic story of drama, intrigue, salvage law, and humor involving Ira Eaton, as chronicled in Diary of a Sea Captain's Wife. Unfortunately, that account will have to wait for another time. The Cuba's bell is on display at the Sexton Museum in Goleta. The Cuba's safe is now in the Santa Barbara Maritime Museum. What was about to happen in just a few hours, about 45 miles to the north, is a disaster unequaled in the United States Navy peacetime history. We leave the island of San Miguel, past Point Conception to Point Honda, to what is often referred to as the Graveyard of the Pacific and the Devil's Jaw. As I studied this image, I was captivated by what I saw, so I coined my own description. Not the Devil's Jaw devouring ship after ship, but the Devil's Hand, fingers stretched, waiting to clutch its next unsuspecting victim. After a summer of fleet exercises in the Puget Sound and Northern California, the U.S. battleships and accompanied destroyers had just concluded a week of dances, parades, and boat races and were warming up to return to their home bases. On the deck of the destroyer USS Young, 2 officers were chatting idly, awaiting the call for all hands to ready the ships for sea. One seemed worried. I know it's a mighty red sky, but that's not what's bothering me," referring to the old saying, "Red sky at night, sailors delight. Red sky at morning, sailors take warning." I guess it's the fact that our new Chief Commissary Steward has been absent over Liberty for 2 days. And the truth is, according to Scuttlebutt, he had a hunch that something is going to happen. Something bad. I actually hadn't thought about it until yesterday when I saw 3 or 4 rats trying to get ashore over the mooring lines. Wow, what a portent of the calamity about to come. On 8 September 1923, the ships of the United States Navy's Destroyer Squadron 11 lined up for what was to be a 24-hour shakedown cruise from San Francisco to San Diego. The destroyers, each 314 feet long, 32 feet wide, were fast. They could make 32 knots, and on this voyage would cruise at 20 knots or 23 miles per hour. In the lead and pictured here was the squadron flagship, the USS Delphi. The ships were ordered to maintain a speed of 20 knots, expecting to reach Point Loma in San Diego at the crack of dawn the next morning. Except for the Delphi, radio silence was to be maintained, and only the Delphi was allowed to request RDF, or Radio Direction Finder bearings, a relatively new navigating technique. Dead reckoning was the standard method of navigation by the fleet. Quoting Wikipedia, "Dead reckoning is the process of estimating one's current position based upon a previously determined position or fix, and advancing that position based upon known or estimated speeds over elapsed time and course." A disadvantage of dead reckoning is that since new positions are calculated solely from previous positions, the errors of the process are cumulative, so the error in the position fix grows with time. A single line column was formed behind the Delphi as they steamed south. This chart and those that follow display the makeup of Squadron 11. Captain Edward H. Watson was the chief or commodore of the squadron. He was one of the Navy's most experienced navigators, whose father before him was navigator for Admiral David Farragut in the Civil War. His flagship, the Delphi, captained by Donald Hunter, was in the lead, followed by 3 divisions. Division 33 was commanded by Robert Morris, his flagship, the USS Lee. Division 31, commanded by William Pye, his flagship, the USS Farragut, and Division 32, commanded by Walter Roper, his flagship, the USS Kennedy. Following the Delphi, the Division 33 ships lined up one behind the other. The S.P. Lee, captained by William Toaz, the Young by Captain William Calhoun, and the Woodbury by Louis P. Davis, and the Nichols by Herbert Roche. Destroyer Division 31 followed. The Farragut, John McLean, the Fuller, Walter Seed, the Percival, Calvin Cobb, the Summers, William Gaddis, and the Chauncey, Richard Booth. The last group, Destroyer Division 32, comprised of the Kennedy, Robert Bell, the Paul Hamilton, Tracy McCauley, the Stoddard, Leslie Bratton, and the Thompson, Thomas Symington. At about 10 a.m., Point Montara Light near Half Moon Bay was passed, and then Pigeon Point Light some 50 miles south of San Francisco. So each of the ship's navigators had an excellent chance to fix their position. As visibility conditions worsened, most of the navigators felt Avo Nuevo Point, halfway between Half Moon Bay and Santa Cruz, would be the last land they would see until reaching Port Arguello Light, some 175 miles ahead. The winds were picking up and the swells increasing, as was customary during early afternoon. The winds and seas were coming from directly west, astern from the destroyers, causing some steering difficulties. 2 years earlier, radio direction finder stations had been established at 4 locations along the California coast, including one at Port Arguello. Like anything new, there were startup bugs, and many older generation seamen had their doubts as to their accuracy. As you recall earlier, Captain Dick Barry of the USS Reno, on a solo speed run, had made a momentous decision which saved many lives. Foregoing the Channel Passage and electing instead to skirt around San Miguel, he rescued 71 survivors of the SS Cuba sinking. This led to the airwaves crackling with urgent messages and created considerable confusion, which led to an argument. William Roper, Commodore of Division 32, called Commodore Watson and requested permission to take his division, consisting of 4 ships, to assist in the Cuba rescue. Deciding that 1 destroyer was sufficient, his request was firmly refused. Some 8 hours later, with the wind and waves continuing to increase and visibility decreasing in fog, the convoy believed they were about an hour away from Point Arguello. Requesting radio bearings was delegated to the squadron flagship in accordance with Navy regulations. Captain Edward Watson and 2 other experienced navigators on board the Delphi had to work largely by the time-honored, if imprecise, technique of dead reckoning. Soundings could not be taken at 20 knots, but they checked their chart work against bearings obtained from the Radio Direction Finding, RDF station at Port Arguello. Sometimes those messages were intercepted by some ships in the squadron, causing worry that their ships were not making the cruising speed of 20 knots and therefore not as far south as they should be. Others worried because their compass courses had the Delphi steering to eastward. The navigator on the Kennedy, having intercepted messages sent to the Delphi, indicated that the sending station was dead ahead. Not one division commander or ship captain challenged the information received, believing that the Delphi was receiving frequent radio bearings and that information must be better than theirs. One further complicating factor was the effects of the Great Kanto earthquake, magnitude 7.9, which occurred 1 week earlier, causing unusual swells and strong current changes off the coast of California, the effect of which remained for a number of days. By 8:30 p.m., visibility was reduced to less than a mile. The dead reckoning on the plotted chart of the Delphi showed them to be well south of Point Arguello. Then another radio bearing was received, to which Captain Hunter murmured, "Another impossible bearing." Navigator Blodgett, "The bearings have been off a few degrees, but they have all put us north of the point. How about a sounding, sir?" The captain shrugged and looked at Commodore Watson. "No, not much use. Possibly can't reach bottom. Spoil our engineering run." At 2100 hours, change course to 95 degrees true. Most of the ships were 150 yards and a mere 13 seconds apart. At exactly 2100 hours, the Delphi made her sharp turn, expecting to be entering into the channel just south of San Miguel Island. Moments later, without warning, the flagship was engulfed in heavy pea-soup layer of fog. At 21:05 came a series of violent bumps, followed by the smashing crash of a head-on collision as she slammed into Honda's jaw and stuck fast. A few hundred yards behind, the USS Lee saw the Delphi suddenly stop and then turn sharply to port, but she quickly struck the coast north of the Delphi. Following her, the USS Young had no time to turn before she ripped her hull open on submerged rocks and rapidly turned over on her starboard side. The next two destroyers, the Woodbury and the Nicholas, turned right and left respectively, but also hit the rocks. Steaming behind them, the USS Farragut was able to back away with relatively minor damage. The USS Fuller piled up near the Woodbury. USS Percival and Somers both narrowly evaded the catastrophe, but the USS Chauncey tried to rescue the men clinging to the capsized Young and herself went to ground nearby. The last four destroyers, the Kennedy, Paul Hamilton, Stoddard, and Thompson, successfully turned clear of the coast and were unharmed. In the darkness and fog enveloping the seven stranded ships, several hundred crewmen were suddenly thrown into a battle for survival against crashing waves and a hostile shore. Seconds before, and convinced the Delphi had run aground on San Miguel or one of her reefs, Captain Hunter immediately ordered, "Signal the squadron and keep repeating it. Keep clear of Westwood and 9 turn, or make a 90-degree turn to the left, hoping to send the trailing ships into the channel and away from San Miguel." He ordered, "All back full," with sirens blasting. The generator died, and all went silent and black. The order was given to abandon ship. Immediately, the Lee entered into the fog into which the Delphi had vanished, and just a moment later spotted the Delphi's lights just before they went out. Captain Toaz commanded, "Stop, stop." At 11 yards a second, that was not going to happen, but the engines slowed her down through nothing short of a miracle. She missed the Delphi by a hair. Huge waves pouring across her deck and battered her constantly. A big chunk of jagged volcanic rock ripped through her side and into the generator, causing all the lights to go out. When the fog cleared, as they clung to anything stationary on the steeply slanted deck, they could see survival was a mere 50 feet away. But with the sea crashing violently about them, it seemed impossible for either a boat or swimmer to take a line without being crushed. Suddenly, the Young rose as if trying to surface like a submarine, and then crashed down. She had run over a submerged pinnacle reef, tearing deep gashes on the starboard side. Seconds later, the Young again surged upward with wind and waves, lodging her upon a submerged ledge. With 15 feet of water in the engine room, all went dark as the generator died. With no time to man boats, rafts, or even life preservers, Captain Calhoun determined the best chance for survival was to stick with the ship and not to jump overboard. The men crawled to the port side just before the Young flipped over, with the right side barely 2 feet above the water. Many of the men were barefoot, in skivvies, soaked and cold. They huddled together for warmth and safety, and to protect themselves from getting swept overboard from surf and swells. In the blackness of the night, and having nothing to hold on to, suddenly a shaft of light, which seemed to have come from heaven, shone upon the pitiful scene. Chief Boatswain's Mate Arthur Peterson noticed a reflection from the glass of one of the portholes. He dove into the sea and vanished, returning with a fire axe in his hand. One by one, he smashed the 14 portholes, providing a hold for the shivering sailors. "Sir, I have lost sight of the Delphi, and the lee has sheered out to port, and the Young has stopped," reported Ensign Bushnell from the crow's nest on the Woodbury. The Young's lights were spotted, then she went dark. Knowing the Young was dead ahead, and spotting the lee, Captain Davis ordered full right rudder to avoid hitting both ships. She struck and apparently jumped over a rock, and then crashed hard into what later became known as Woodbury Rock, and today is known as Destroyer Rock. The rock is a jagged, precipitous mini-island. 5 of the crew volunteered to make a daredevil leap between the ship and the petrified lava to inspect the rock with its tall, stubby spines and spires, edges as sharp as a dagger. As the crew scanned the area with the searchlight, suddenly, there on the surface, they spotted a dark mass. It was the Young on her side, with men hanging on for dear life. Then layers of fog moved in and shrouded the horrific sight. As the Nicholas followed in the wake of the other ships, the Woodbury could be seen about 250 yards ahead, and the Young disappeared as curtains of fog drifted in. The skipper, Captain Roche, ordered an immediate left turn to avoid collision with the Woodbury and the Young. As she did, she crossed the northern rim of the Devil's Jaw. Rocks ripped the starboard propeller from its shaft. The Nicholas drifted and came to a stop on a clump of rocks, and after trying to dislodge itself, the remaining propeller failed. She was listing 30 degrees, so all hands were ordered port side. She was exposed to the constant assault of the thundering surf and surging wind pouring over her listing deck. The USS Farragut, the flagship commanded by William Pye and skippered by John McLean, was the lead destroyer in Division 31. Following her were the Fuller, the Percival, the Somers, and the Chauncey. Sighting searchlights and hearing what he thought were sirens, Lieutenant Hartman told his captain, "I believe it is a collision, sir." The captain later said, "I saw ships steering out of column in every direction." The Farragut now had only 40 yards of open water between her bow and the fantail of the Nicholas. "Full astern, hard right rudder," came the command. As she came to a slow stop, and hearing the cries of men calling for help, he thought he saw a whaleboat, but instead it was a huge rock, and he was drifting right at it. "All back emergency," he ordered. The generators, robbed of their steam, shut down. All lights, including the backup lights, went out. The Fuller was just 200 yards behind and closing fast. The oncoming Fuller then struck a submerged rock which cut deep gashes into her sides and bottom. She rapidly lost power, but momentum kept her coming. As the Farragut turned, the Fuller came within inches of the propeller guards and grazed into the Farragut. She struck at midship, leaving a deep dent and carrying away life rails, awnings, stanchions, and stretchers. Captain McLean thought he might be able to back the Farragut out on roughly the same course he came in on, but just as he was making good progress, the jaws took one more bite. She shuddered and was lifted bodily by a great wave and dropped. Another miracle. No serious damage was reported. She backed into deeper, safer waters. The USS Farragut, which had run aground, was the first ship to extricate herself from the Devil's jaw. She would survive. The deep gash in the Fuller was about 4 feet in diameter. Water was gushing in with the force of a gigantic pressure hose. She was now some 40 feet away from the pinnacles that were above the water. Winds and waves brought the Fuller up on the exposed rock. There, her bow jammed in between 2 rocks. In a heroic move, machinist mate Frank Moon sized up the situation, found a rope, fastened a lasso, and after a few tries, caught a large stump of rock. Then, after proceeding hand over hand, he surveyed the rock and estimated it could provide a refuge for 20 men. The skipper, Captain Walter Seed, decided the rock was too small and dangerous. Meanwhile, Moon spotted the wounded Woodbury about 100 yards away. The Percival caught a dim glimpse of the ship ahead steering sharply to port with her speed lights showing red. Captain Calvin Cobb immediately rang down both engines. Not liking the situation and being 250 or so yards to the right of the fast-approaching Somers, he decided to reverse engines full speed and hightail it out of there. The Somers and the Chauncey went streaking past her. Captain William Gaddis of the Somers was uneasy with the new course, since it did not quite tally with his dead reckoning, which had them further north and closer to shore. When the frantic command was given by the Delphi to turn 9, he gave instruction not to do so, sensing something was terribly wrong. Seconds later came word, "We will hit the beach if we stay on this course. Stop." Gaddis immediately countermanded, ordering to 1/3 ahead, right rudder. Almost at once, a large breaker suddenly emerged from the fog, signaling that a submerged reef lay 50 feet away. "Reverse engines, full speed," he ordered as the bow struck a hidden ledge. Then, while backing up, she struck another hiding fang of the jaw. Her damage was moderate, but she was able to make it to safer anchorage, joining the Farragut. The Somers was the second destroyer, though grounded, to live to see another day. The Chauncey, skippered by Richard Booth, was engulfed in thick gray fog, but the captain was allowed a brief glimpse ahead of lights both to his right and his left. He also was able to see a ship coming towards them. As he cut his speed, a message was received from the Delphi, warning to keep clear of westward. The Chauncey, using right and left rudder movements, was able to further reduce its forward speed. A sweep of their searchlight revealed a horrific sight. Ships strewn about like toys, and men hanging on to the overturned young. Captain Booth knew there were 2 things he had to do: get out of there and try to rescue the young's crew. The poor sailors, hanging on for dear life, had enough to deal with without the fear they might be rammed or the propeller's wash might cause the young to slide off the ledge it was resting on. Backing at full speed, he planned to make another try, but fate ruled otherwise. The Chauncey's stern was seized by the outgoing undertow and raked under the port propellers of the young, which cut through the starboard side as if it were cardboard. The ship was dealt repeated knockout blows from a series of breakers, and then a giant wave tossed the destroyer onto a sunken reef. The Kennedy, flagship of Commander Roper of Destroyer Division 32, was skippered by Robert Bell. A radio compass bearing was intercepted, indicating that the Delphi was north of Point Arguello and closer to shore. Noticing a sort of bunching up of ships at 2105, the Kennedy slowed and soon after came to a stop as did the other ships of this division. The Kennedy, now dead in the water and being tossed by relentless waves, felt a bump in the bow. "Holy Moses, we're aground!" shouted Captain Bell as he ordered, "Back full." Taking soundings, they determined they were closer to shore than previously believed. Then a signal was received from the Delphi, "Turn 9." "Disregard that order," Division Commander Roper directed to Captain Bell. Using whistles and megaphone, he ordered the ships in his division to disregard the Delphi's orders and instead directed to turn seaward. Destroyer Division 32 was spared. Only 5 minutes had elapsed since the Delphi tried to send out futile warnings. One by one, 9 ships had steered, follow the leader, towards the hell that awaited them behind the curtain of fog that had hid the rocks of Honda. 7 proud destroyers had gone to their death. 2 more had felt but escaped the fangs of the devil's jaw. For mere minutes, in some instances seconds, whistles blew, sirens screamed, searchlights swung, and blinkers gave their warning. Then, as power ran out, all grew dark and silent. The silence of a graveyard in which the stranded destroyers stood as immobile as potential coffins for almost 800 courageous fighting men praying for a miraculous rescue. In an isolated, remote, and desolate area, the Southern Pacific Railroad, as a means of inspecting and protecting their tracks, erected a station house, 2 rows of bunkhouses providing quarters for 16 men, and a barn, the only structures for miles. Living in the house was Southern Pacific Railroad section foreman John Giorbis, a square-set, middle-aged man of Greek ancestry. On the evening of the disaster, he heard 2 sounds like muffled explosions. He ran to the 2nd story of his home and, looking out over the window, saw a light appear and then disappear. It was shortly after 9 p.m. Giorbis grabbed a lantern and rushed out, crossing the tracks, and made his way down the dangerous sloping mesa, pitted with holes, tangled roots, and branches. When he reached the cliff, he laid down on his stomach, head and shoulders over the ledge. He thought he heard voices and shouted several times, but heard no response. He immediately returned to the station house and called his supervisor, Trainmaster T.J. Foley, reporting what appeared to be a shipwrecked U.S. naval destroyer. Foley made arrangement for sending doctors, surgical supplies, food, blankets, and clothing to the site of the wreck. He ordered a steam shovel car gang and fence crew to Honda to provide assistance wherever needed. Loading stretchers onto a baggage car, he headed south to the disaster. Giorbis returned to the wreck and quickly set upon helping rescue men from the Delphi. He was able to get a rope to the crew, who connected it to a heavy line which was pulled ashore, setting up a means for the sailors to work their way there. The rescuers and uninjured sailors spent hours dragging men out of the water. Moments earlier, the Delphi's stern was close enough for some sailors to jump from the fantail and propeller guard onto the rocks. Oil from a punctured tank surged into the sea, mixed with the surf, and washed over the ship. Then the pounding surf swung the stern around away from the rocks, closing that avenue of escape. 3 men who had jumped into the sea from the bow were overwhelmed by the pounding waves. Delphi Engineer First Class Raymond Rodenhamel ventured down the oil-drenched ladder attached to the ship and was able to snatch them one by one back onto the ship. The last, James Pearson, fireman first class, seconds before he had dived into the sea to save sailors in trouble. Tragically, the glasses he was wearing smashed, and pieces of glass lodged into his eyes, blinding him and causing great pain. Twice he went under before Rodenhamel, with help, was able to finally get a now unconscious Pearson onto the ship. When Pearson regained consciousness, crazed by pain in his eyes and by the effects of the fuel he had swallowed, he fought with the strength of a maniac, as if demon-possessed. For his own safety and that of the rest of the crew, he was tied to an angle iron while ways to abandon ship were weighed. Lieutenant Blodgett thought the closest rock, about 20 feet away, could be reached by a strong swimmer. E.R. Weisendanger immediately volunteered and dived into the oily sea. Twice he was washed out of sight beneath the Delphi's bottom by a vicious undertow, while miraculously avoiding being crushed between the rocks and the ship. Somehow he made it and climbed the oily rocks. A line was thrown and then a second, establishing a means of escape. With one end secured to the rocks and the other end secured to the deckhouse, he was tasked with keeping the line taut and with the swaying of the ship letting out enough line. Volunteers took on this Herculean task. Then a monstrous breaker lifted the Delphi as James Conway, fireman third class, was on the line. The line slackened and then went taut as a piano wire and slingshot the poor sailor to his death. Another casualty, cabin cook Sophronia Dalida, who was, after falling from the line, choked and drowned from oil in his lungs. It was determined that it was impossible to get Pearson across until daylight in calmer seas on a raft or on a breeches buoy. Pharmacist mate George Jordan was busy attending to the needs of those in shock, concussions, broken bones, bruises, and by far most prevalent with deep cuts to hands and feet from the razor-sharp lava. No one knew where they were, but the sound of a locomotive whistle raised all their spirits. They were not castaways on some deserted island, but on the mainland. A few men were able to scale the cliffs and make it to the rails when they saw a fire and joined the sailors from the SS Lee. Before continuing, I want to state the heroic events described on and around the grounded ships are but a few of the many, many daring, brave, and gallant efforts performed that day. The men with the steam shovel, the fence gangs, Georvis's crew, and local citizens worked with great energy to get the men ashore from the wrecked ships. First aid was provided and bonfires were built on the bluffs and near the station house to provide light for the rescue effort and warmth for the sailors who made it ashore. Fortunately, there was a hefty stack of railroad ties nearby to fuel the fires. Meanwhile, W.S. Brandt, Lompoc City Marshal, had been notified and together with Ronald Adams, owner and editor of the Lompoc Record, made haste. After a hectic ride on a dark, narrow, curvy, badly paved country road, they jumped on a waiting motor track car. It was dark and foggy as they made their way towards the scene. Suddenly, one of the railroad men on the track car yelled, "Quick, everybody, get off the car, get it off the track, there's a train coming." Together, they lifted the car off the track before a huge blur of light exploded out of the fog as the locomotive flashed by. Though the oncoming train could not be seen, the railroader's keen sense had felt the vibration of the train through the soles of his feet avoiding what would have been yet another tragedy at Honda. The SP Lee was in a perilous position, listing 30 degrees, when Captain Toaz saw through the fog a ship bearing down on the lee. Suddenly, as an answer to his prayers, she had come to an abrupt halt, stopped by a cluster of rocks. Asking for volunteers to take a rock across the churning waters to scale the 100-foot cliff, many responded, but 2 were picked: Coxswain C.M. Carlson and Seaman First Class C.J. Stahl. The men, in a small rubber raft, fought their way towards the cliff about 50 feet away. They were tossed, spun, tilted, and they paddled desperately. They made it to the base of the cliff only because that is where the raging sea took them. Clinging spread-eagle to the wet, slippery surface like human flies, they eventually were able to establish a hold with 2 lines and make it back to the ship. The ferrying of the men commenced, 8 per raft trip. As the captain and the commander, being the last to leave, entered the raft, they heard the loud whistle of a train as cheers and jubilation revived the spirits of the shivering, oil-drenched men, cramped, standing shoulder to shoulder on the small ledge. Stahl and Carlson returned to the group, having found a somewhat negotiable passage. It was a slow, steep, dangerous climb. Wherever one stepped or touched, they were cut by lava as sharp as broken bottles. Pharmacist mate M.C. Watts, shoeless and dressed only in his skivvies, bleeding himself upon reaching the mesa, administered aid to the scores of injured by wiping cuts and fashioning bandages torn from garments to stop bleeding. At that moment, Georvis and his crew emerged out of the fog. Watts told Georvis that at least 3 destroyers were on the rocks. "We'll need doctors and medical supplies," he urged. Georvis told him how to reach the section house and ran back to telephone the needs and the grim news. Commander Toaz and a small group of men headed south in search of the Delphi. The Young's hull was ripped open along the length of the starboard side, flooding the watertight compartments. The sharp lava rocks sliced her open with the ease of an electric can opener. In just 90 seconds, she was flat on her side. As she rolled, most of the crew, following orders to stay with the ship and their instinct, followed her over, grasping for a foothold. Those who did not met their death by drowning, as did the poor souls below deck, an engine man and 7 firemen. Fearing an explosion from the steam built up in the boilers, Captain Calhoun asked for a volunteer to turn off the master valves below deck. Fireman First Class F.T. Scott agreed. The boilers did not explode, nor did Scott return. With surf crashing over the ship and men clinging to the porthole handholds created by Peterson's axe, he set upon recovering hemp rope and with lines tied the men together in groups of 8 for safety. They looked like stacks of asparagus. Then all went dark for the 80 men 18 inches above the surface of the sea. The nearest piece of land, Bridge Rock, was 100 yards away. Peterson and Executive Lieutenant Gene Hersinger were about to try the impossible: swim through the surging waters just as the Chauncey came crashing by and hurled high on the ledge, where she lay, cut the swimming distance by about 25 yards, and had an effect of calming the surging sea. Captain of the Chauncey, Richard Booth's first obligation was to get his men ashore, and second, to help rescue the men on the Young. With great difficulty, 2 lines were carried to shore, and immediately 2 of her rafts began ferrying men to the western cliffs of the Bridge Rock, while unbeknownst to the Chauncey, the Delphi was on the northern shore of the same rock. The rafts were soon covered with oil and very slippery, and as they tried to step ashore, the oil was also on the rocks, causing men to skid and fall. In the dark, they made their way up the almost perpendicular cliff, sustaining cuts to hands and feet. Reaching the top, they saw half-clad men from the Delphi, staggering, freezing, and dazed. Back on the Young, Peterson fashioned and knotted together 3 40-foot ropes, tied one end to a stanchion and the other to a donut life preserver. With a grin on his face, he asked Captain Calhoun, "Permission to go ashore, sir?" "Permission granted, Pete, and God go with you." Fighting the surging, oil-covered breakers, he was able to overcome and swim the 75 yards to the Chauncey, where he exchanged the line for a stronger one. Obtaining a 7-man raft from the Chauncey, he returned safely to the Young with the raft. After 12 arduous trips between the ships, all those accounted for were safely on the Chauncey by 11:30 p.m., some 2.5 hours after the crash. Unfortunately, missing were those who had been swept to sea and the poor souls penned in the lower compartments with no chance to escape. From the Chauncey, the crew of the Young then faced the hazard of being ferried from the Chauncey to Bridge Rock and then up the steep, lacerating wall of the rugged rock. Captain Davis had tried unsuccessfully to back the Woodbury off the rock, and in so doing, the gap between the bow and the rock widened. Lines were finally secured and the evacuation began. Chief Radioman Grover Dickman described it this way: "The destroyer was settling in the stern. As the thundering breakers struck her, the bow would rise and fall. The lines would become taut and strained until the walls of the roaring water rolled past. Then they would become slack and sag. As officers and men climbed, monkey fashion, over the line from the ship to shore, only superhuman effort kept them hanging on from the snapping hawsers. In the process of abandoning the ship, 2 of the crew thought they heard a call for help near the bow. Shining a light, they saw a man struggling to swim. H.F. Williams, Seaman Second Class, jumped into the sea, and with the aid of the second, N.H. Owens, Quartermaster First Class, pulled him aboard. The second swimmer was found to be boatswain's mate Braden, who had been washed overboard from the side of the Young. Eventually, all made it to the rock, where the ship's heavy wooden plank was chopped up for fuel to light tar pots and paint cans. The fog was so thick it had become a moisture-soaked blanket. Shortly after midnight, the captains of the 4 ships, Delphi, Lee, Young, and Chauncey, whose crews were on the mainland, made a tally of their men. 28 missing, 25 from the Young, 3 from the Delphi. Both the Lee and the Chauncey had accounted for all their crew. In the meantime, Donald Sudden, a local rancher, had been awakened by his wife after the constant ringing of their party line telephone. After listening in and learning of a shipwreck and being aware the Arguello Light had no telephone, she asked her husband to drive there and inform them of the activity. After driving the rough and bumpy grade, he arrived there to find 5 bruised and bewildered sailors recently pulled from the sea. The men were in no condition to survive the tortuous ride to the section house, so he drove there to get medical help for the sailors. Upon arrival with the news of the five, Captain Calhoun of the Young was told they were from his ship, and one of the five was named Scotty. "Thank God for that, thank God for that," said the captain. The lighthouse crew had been aroused about 10:30 p.m. by cries for help from the sea. No landings could be made at the rocky point where they were because of the sheer cliffs and pounding surf. They were redirected to the southern, more protective cliffs where lines were dropped from the almost perpendicular 75-foot cliffs. So exhausted, numb with cold, and drenched with oil, the men could not muster the strength to tie the ropes around themselves. Two men were sent down the ropes, tied ropes around each of the survivors, and then they were lifted out one by one up upon the cliff. Scott, believed to be lost after going below to close the master valve on the Young's burners, told the following: "Through God-given strength, I was able to open the airlock scuttle, and then was sucked into the sea as I reached the submerged deck. I grabbed some sort of flotsam and passed out. Upon awakening, he was in smooth waters and deep silence when he bumped into a raft and was pulled aboard. With no visibility, all began to shout and then would listen. Soon they heard a response and paddled in that direction, coming upon 3 men in a raft without a paddle. Taking hold of the grab ropes, they were pushed by seas and driven by a northwest wind. There had been 2 rafts held together by the grab ropes. Only one made it to the lighthouse. The other carried 3 men, but there was but one paddle for both boats. When it became obvious that they could not control both rafts with one paddle, the 3 men deliberately let go of the grab ropes, shouting, "Make a good landing, Scotty." For several days following, both air and sea searchers did not locate the raft nor any trace of the heroes that gave up their lives to save their fellow man. At about 2 o'clock in the morning, a relief train arrived carrying heaps of blankets, comforters, overalls, trousers, coats, and sweaters donated by the residents of Lompoc. While nowhere near enough to go around, but the neediest were taken care of. Also, getting off the train and making her way through the crowds of sailors was Mrs. Charles Atkins, wife of the telegraph officer at Surf. In a large market basket, she carried several dozen eggs, quarts of milk, pounds of coffee, and loaves of bread. Hardly enough to feed 400 sailors. But her mere presence elevated the spirits of the sailors and of the 2 exhausted Lompoc doctors who had arrived earlier caring for the injured. Railroad foreman Tobin gave news that food would be arriving with the train at 4 a.m. That same train would take the most seriously injured to the Cottage Hospital in Santa Barbara. Upon its arrival, the railroad gang loaded the injured onto the train and unloaded boxes of food and medical supplies provided by the citizens, restaurants, and markets in San Luis Obispo. With the seriously injured taken care of, Mrs. Atkins turned her attention to making coffee and sandwiches. Pictured here, Ma Atkins, as the sailors called her, serving shivering sailors coffee. Her help in dressing wounds and her gentle willingness to do anything that would make the boys comfortable would be remembered for many years by the Navy men. Mrs. Atkins mothered the boys for nearly 24 hours without rest. With gaping holes in the fuller's side, Being pounded badly and in danger of slipping off her perch and sinking, Captain Seed's thoughts were on evacuating the ship. He called for volunteers to launch the whaleboat and make its way to the Woodbury with lines to allow ferrying between the ships. Assessing the situation, Ensign Jones determined the whaleboat had to be launched starboard, navigate around the Fuller's stern to the port side, grab the hawser, row to the Woodbury, and make fasten the hawser. From the start, things did not go well. As the whaleboat was being lowered, suspended a few feet above the water, a huge wave dropped the end of the boat into the sea. Quick thinking, the men on the deck immediately cast loose the forward fall. While avoiding being swamped, the only light was smashed, and the oarlock was damaged beyond repair. Without the help of the steering oar, they zigzagged their way towards a passage between two big rocks, as shown here. At that moment, a huge wave lifted the whaleboat up and over the rocks, but without the steering oar and the raging seas, the whaleboat could not get close to the ship. Instead, Jones ordered the boat out to sea and drifted with the current, hoping to try again during daylight. With the whaleboat vanished, an attempt was made in heavy seas to send a rubber craft with 4 men the 100 yards to the Woodbury. The raft was reduced to a plaything by the seas, spinning, yawing, and flipping it over, dumping the men into the sea. Somehow, through divine grace, they all made it back to the raft and were pulled back aboard the Fuller. With the sea pounding her, Captain Seed feared she might turn over. As dawn broke, the whaleboat appeared as if a gray ghost in the gray dawn. Captain Seed, shouting over wind and wave, asked Jones if he could try to take a line to the Woodbury. After several attempts failed, they were able to make it to the rock, hand over hand. They were ordered to stay where they were, on the rock. Conditions worsened as higher and higher waves cascaded over her forecastle when Frank Moon, of previous heroics, approached the captain, volunteering to swim across with the line. Contemplating for a brief moment, the captain offered, "I'll see if I can swim across. If I can, follow me with the line." Leaving Executive Officer Homer Davis in charge, he went on to say, "If I make it, send Moon over with the line and have the crew in life jackets haul themselves over the line one at a time. If I don't make it, good luck, you're on your own." Tossing off his jacket, hat, and shoes, he made a running start and dived into the water so rough it boiled and bubbled like a witch's cauldron. Both he and Moon made it to the outstretched hands of Jones and his men on the rock. Once the lines were fastened, the abandoning of ship proceeded, though there was much difficulty. With crisis upon crisis, all made it to the rock safely. The Nichols skipper, Lieutenant Commander Herbert Roche, did his utmost to prevent the loss of the destroyer as the heavy seas broke over her and the Honda rocks pushed into her hull. But the ship was taken by currents and drifted slowly astern, coming to a stop stern high on a clump of rocks with a 25% list to starboard. Throughout the night, the Four-Stacker's crew strove valiantly in the face of Honda's heavy odds, but in the morning, as the waves mounted and the Nicholas's situation became critical, the captain ordered, "Abandon ship." Having secured a lifeline between the Nicholas and the shore, the rescue was extremely dangerous. In a raft, 6 or 7 men at a time were subjected to oil-covered waves dousing the men. Many were thrown overboard but were able to make it to shore. On the shore, railroad gangs and local farmers had brought ropes and tackle and were on the small strip of beach to haul in the rafts after each was loaded. By the time the last load had been taken off the Nicholas, she had sunk considerably and was in the danger of rolling onto her side. The last load included Captain Roche and other officers. A huge swell tossed the raft, flipping all into the sea. Some were able to get back on the raft, but others were carried away from it. Then another swell threw them towards the shore and another back towards the raft, close enough that those in the boat could pull them in. Yet another miracle. The evacuation of the Nicholas was accomplished without loss of life. Fog from the shore had shrouded the Woodbury and the Fuller, as well as a commercial fishing boat, the Buena Amor de Roma, as she came puttering out of the fog. Her captain, Giovanni Nocetti, commanded one of the boats of the Larco fishing fleet. You may recall Sebastian Larco being mentioned in previous presentations. The Roma would play a heroic part in rescuing the castaways on Woodbury or Destroyer Rock, a task that took plenty of courage, daring seamanship, and long, tiring hours. The Santa Barbara Daily News on September 10th reported, "The Roma left Santa Barbara with her sister fishing boat, the North America, at 1 a.m. Sunday morning to fish off of the Honda banks. Neither knew of the disaster. Suddenly, at daybreak Sunday, the Roma found herself trolling past a wreck. The dim outline of a destroyer, the Fuller, could be seen through the veil of fog. Putting in closer, Captain Nocetti discovered men clinging to bare rocks. Forgetting their trolling lines, the fishermen threw over their anchor and rushed for their skiff. They worked almost till noon, carrying men from the Fuller and the Woodbury to the Somers and the Percival. Their first rescue was of 5 men who had clung all night long to a projecting reef, unable to reach the main rock because of terrific seas that were running. These 5 men had hung and clung on through the long night hours with the grimness of determination. But when they felt the strong arms of the fishermen encircling them, they fell back limp and were lifted aboard by 2 fishermen, while a third held fast to the rock to keep the frail skiff from being dashed to pieces against the reef. Those 4 fishermen worked without ceasing until they, with whaleboats finally sent to their aid by the destroyers standing out to sea, had completed taking the men aboard. The task finished, Captain Nocetti ordered his men on with their trolling, in a matter-of-fact way, as though saving men from wrecked vessels and reefs was all in a day's work. The final tally of personnel was taken at noon on the 9th. The Delphi's loss of 3 did not change, but the count of the capsized young was reduced to 20. While any loss of life is devastating, but through the heroic efforts of the sailors previously mentioned and the many not mentioned herein, the count was nothing short of miraculous. Some 800 men who were aboard the 7 ill-fated destroyers had been at risk. And on shore, enough cannot be said about the civilian heroes without whose help hundreds of lives could have been lost. Thanks to the Southern Pacific Railroad for all their contributions, including providing 40 railroad men as well as facilities and equipment. Pictured in these photographs are Railroad Section Foreman Giorvis, whose keen ears and eyes, presence of mind, and physical stamina and determination played such a vital role in the rescue effort. and Trainmaster Foley, whose arrangements for the relief train and other services was timely and graciously provided. Special recognition is given to Lompoc doctors Kelleher and Hedges, who treated cuts and gashes, broken bones, hypothermia, and other ailments. Ma Atkins, for her unceasing efforts to provide first aid, coffee, food, and comfort to hundreds. Local ranchers and farmers who rigged up breeches buoys from the cliff top down to the wrecked ships. The generosity of Lompoc, San Luis Obispo, and Surf citizens who contributed food, blankets, and muscle power. To Captain Nochetti and crew of the Roma for their perilous, daring, and courageous rescue efforts. And to scores not specifically mentioned. A special train was assembled in San Francisco and reached Honda at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, where 38 officers and 517 enlisted men boarded the train. After a long stop in Santa Barbara, where the Red Cross and YMCA served sandwiches, coffee, and cakes, the train continued on to San Diego. Having been stripped of her valuable material, the destroyers were written off as total losses. Due to the difficult location of the wrecks and the effects of the pounding Pacific surf on the ship hulls, no scrapping was ever performed and the ships were left to their fate. Wave action began breaking up the stranded ships. Day after day, week after week, pounding wave action and grinding against the rocks turned the destroyers into smashed and twisted skeletons. The waves picked the wrecks bare as bones, the rocks chewing them into rusty remnants. As they slipped into deeper and deeper water, the devil's jaw was finished his chewing, waiting for the next victim. A detail of 17 men and 2 officers with weak bodies and shattered nerves was left at the scene to watch for bodies and prevent looting of the ships. Somehow, through all the confusion, the Navy dropped the ball. They were left there 3 days, camping like refugees or castaways, without shelter and adequate supplies. They had to sleep in the open, since the Giorvas section house had been converted into a morgue. As word of their plight reached the citizens of Lompoc, Santa Barbara, and San Luis Obispo, they provided food, blankets, and other essentials. After a few days, as seas subsided, they were able to board the Chauncey and obtain ample provisions and supplies. Over the next 8 weeks, a total of 17 bodies were recovered. 6 were never found. On September 11, 1923, 3 days after the disaster, the Navy wasted no time in establishing a court of inquiry. The board's responsibility was to thoroughly sift through and determine the facts and to give its opinion as to whether any offenses occurred. The inquiry was to be held in secret, as was normally the case in such matters. The throngs of newspaper reporters conjured up their own theories. Was there something to hide? Bring out all the facts into the open, they demanded. The next day, someone fumbled the ball by sending a report of the inspection of the Somers and Farragut to the wrong Navy Department. A matter of small import, but things got blown out of proportion. First reports said 5 ships, then 7, now 2 more. With outrage, wild guesses, and vicious gossip coming from all corners, the Secretary of the Navy, Edwin Denby, ordered the inquiry be held publicly, entirely contrary to custom. Now, what was a tragic accident became a witch hunt, looking for heads to roll. For 19 days, the Board of Inquiry interviewed the captains and some of the crew. 2 weeks into the proceedings, Captain Watson, in his closing remarks, under oath, lamenting the loss of his shipmates, took full responsibility. fully and solely responsible. None of his subordinates should be blamed. Captain Calhoun, while testifying, broke down as he read the names of the 20 men who perished when the Young rolled over. He commended Captain Watson. "I can only hope that if I ever am faced with the tragedy that faced him that night, I'll be half the man that he was. Cool, courageous, and thoughtful, never missing an opportunity to aid." On October 31st, the court's unexpected findings were announced. The Court of Inquiry ruled that the disaster was the fault of the fleet commander and the flagship's navigators. They assigned blame to the captain of each ship, following the tradition that a captain's first responsibility is to his own ship, even when in formation. 11 officers involved would be brought before the General Court-Martial on the charges of negligence and culpable inefficiency to perform one's duty. What had happened to the follow the leader long established but unwritten destroyer doctrine? The findings were greeted with satisfaction by the press and the public, and especially so by congressional politicians who had been criticized for not having passed appropriations the previous year for equipment which might have averted the disaster. With Secretary Derby's uttered approval, it seemed as if certain factions in Washington, the real tragedy at Honda was the loss of 7 splendid fighting ships. The 23 unreplaceable lives seemed to be of secondary importance. 23 officers and men were recommended for citations by the Board of Inquiry, and over 75 more by Rear Admiral Kittle, commander of destroyer squadrons. I will highlight several. For coolness, intelligence, and seaman-like ability, William Calhoun, commander of the Young. For great bravery in swimming a distance of about 75 yards through a rough and turbulent sea in order to test the feasibility of and make arrangements for the salvage of his crew, Walter Seed, Lieutenant Commander of the Fuller. For displaying courage in volunteering and manning a whaleboat which they pulled throughout the night in the face of constant and imminent danger, Ensign Jones and his whaleboat crew. For extraordinary heroineship in swimming with a line from the Young to the Chauncey in heavy and turbulent seas, Arthur Peterson, Chief Boatswain's Mate. For extraordinary heroism in swimming with a line from the Fuller to a rock through a rough and turbulent sea in order to salvage the crew of that vessel, Frank Moon, Machinist Mate First Class. For remaining at his post in the engine room of the Chauncey until the water was above his waist, C.G. Ostergaard, Machinist First Class. And for meritorious conduct in remaining at their post in the fire room of the Fuller until driven out by the inrush of rising water, 5 seamen. The General Court-Martial convened on 1 November. Squadron Commander Captain Edward H. Watson and the Delphi's Lieutenant Commander Donald Hunter were found guilty of culpable inefficiency and negligence. With the exception of the Nichols skipper, Commander Roche, all the other skippers were found not guilty, and Roche's guilty verdict was soon overturned by Admiral Robertson. While both were denied future promotions, Donald Hunter went on to serve as navigator on the battleship Nevada and later as an instructor at the Naval War College. Captain Watson was commended by his peers and the government for assuming full responsibility of the disaster at Honda Point. He could have tried to blame a variety of factors for the disaster, but instead he set a great example for those others by allowing the responsibility to be placed entirely on his shoulders. His energetic leadership of rescue operations and display of personal character became widely known and admired in and outside the Navy. He served out his career as Assistant Commandant of the 14th Naval District at Pearl Harbor and retired in 1929. In 1974, a team of divers recovered the anchor from the Chauncey and placed it on a cement pad near the site as a memorial. In this picture, a ceremony was held near the anchor to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the wrecks, and a plaque listing the names of the 23 lost sailors was dedicated. Since then, the bluff on which the anchor rested has been deemed unstable, and due to numerous safety hazards, the anchor and plaque have been removed and are on display for all to see at the Lompoc Historical Society.